Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're uncovering a shocking turn. Mrs. Nghia collapses and ends up in the hospital. Then Linh shows up with resignation papers, threatening to bring the crowd to her bedside if she won't sign. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. Morning arrived with bad news that didn't knock. It barged in. Mrs. Nghia's breathing had been shallow all night, her chest tight, her hands cold. Even sitting still felt like running. Tu Tieu stayed close, watching her carefully, but Mrs. Nghia kept insisting she was fine, because proud women don't admit they're breaking. Then the phone rang again. Another unknown number. Another wave of messages. More proof, more outrage, more threats. Mrs. Nghia's fingers trembled as she set the phone down. They won't stop. Tu Tieu reached for her hand. Ko, don't read it. Not right now. Mrs. Nghia tried to inhale, then suddenly froze, eyes widening. Her hand pressed against her chest like she was trying to hold her heart in place. Tu Tieu's blood went cold. Ko? Mrs. Nghia's lips parted, but no words came. She swayed once, just once, then crumpled toward the floor. Ko Nghia? Tu Tieu caught her before her head hit the table. For a second, everything was panic and weight and helplessness. Tu Tieu's hands shook as she lifted Mrs. Nghia's shoulders. Breathe, Ko. Please, breathe. Mrs. Nghia's eyelids fluttered, then closed fully. Tu Tieu fumbled for her phone and called emergency services, voice breaking but controlled enough to be understood. She gave the address, described the symptoms, begged them to hurry. When she hung up, she looked down at Mrs. Nghia's face. Pale, exhausted, betrayed by a body that had carried too much. And in Tu Tieu's chest, anger lit like a match. Because Linh hadn't just attacked a company, she had attacked an old woman's heart. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights were too bright and too cold. The waiting area smelled like disinfectant and fear. Tu Tieu paced in front of the examination room while nurses moved briskly in and out. Every time the door opened, her stomach dropped. Finally, a doctor stepped out, expression serious but calm. Family? Tu Tieu stood quickly. I'm with her. How is she? The doctor sighed. Her blood pressure is dangerously high, severe stress. She fainted from a combination of exhaustion and anxiety. We're stabilizing her now. Tu Tieu swallowed. Is she going to be okay? She's lucky she got here when she did, the doctor said. But she needs rest, no stress, no surprises. Tu Tieu nodded, but her eyes stung. Rest? How could Mrs. Nghia rest when the world outside was trying to destroy her? The doctor added, if she pushes herself, there's risk of a more serious episode. Tu Tieu's jaw tightened. We'll protect her. The doctor looked at her with quiet warning. Then protect her from the phone, the news, and any conflict. Keep visitors limited. Tu Tieu nodded again, heart heavy. Then her own phone buzzed. A message from the company manager. Board meeting today. They say Mrs. Nghia is unfit to lead. They want an interim representative. Tu Tieu's blood went ice cold. Unfit? Interim representative? That was the compassion trap Linh wanted. If Mrs. Nghia looked weak in public, the board could justify taking her power for the company's safety. And if they did it now, while she lay in a hospital bed, it would be done before Yuri could even catch a signal. Tu Tieu stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, hands steady. Delay the meeting. I'm coming. Mrs. Nghia was moved to a quiet room. When Tu Tieu finally stepped inside, Mrs. Nghia's eyes were open, but dull with fatigue. Her voice came out thin. Tu Tieu, where am I? Tu Tieu forced a small smile and sat beside her. Hospital. You fainted, Ko. Please don't scare me like that again. Mrs. Nghia blinked slowly, shame rising behind her eyes. I'm weak. No, Tu Tieu said firmly. You're human. Mrs. Nghia's gaze drifted toward the window. If Yuri were here... Tu Tieu's throat tightened. He's trying. He just can't get signal. Mrs. Nghia swallowed, then whispered, "What will they do to the company while I'm here?" Tu Tieu didn't want to lie. Not to her. Not now. "The board is nervous," Tu Tieu said carefully. "They might try to appoint an interim representative." Mrs. Nghier's eyes widened. "Because I fainted?" "Because Lin wants to prove you can't lead," Tu Tieu replied, voice low, "and the board is scared of public pressure." Mrs. Nghia closed her eyes, pain and anger mixing. "So even my illness becomes their excuse." Tu Tieu squeezed her hand. "Cool, listen to me. You do not sign anything here. Not medical paperwork you don't understand. Not company paperwork. Nothing." Mrs. Nghier's eyes opened again, startled. Why would anyone bring company papers to a hospital? Tu Tieu's expression hardened. Because a hospital is where people sign when they're scared. Before Mrs. Nghia could answer, a knock came at the door. Tu Tieu's body stiffened immediately. A nurse opened the door slightly. "Mrs. Nghia, you have visitors." Tu Tieu stood. "No visitors. Doctor's orders." The nurse hesitated. "They said they're from the company." Tu Tieu's eyes flashed. "Who?" The door opened wider. 2 board members stepped in. Faces polite, hands clasped, voices soft like they were attending a funeral. Behind them, 1 step back, half hidden, Lin. Tu Tieu's blood turned to fire. Mrs. Nghier's eyes widened in shock. "Lin?" Lin stepped forward slowly, the perfect expression of concerned innocence on her face. "Nghia, I heard you collapsed. I was so worried." Tu Tieu moved between them instantly. "Get out." A male board member raised his hands. "Miss Tu Tieu, please. We're not here to cause stress. We're here to support." Support. The word sounded like a lie wearing perfume. The female board member approached the bed, voice gentle. "Mrs. Nghia, you need to focus on recovery. The company can't add pressure on you." Mrs. Nghier's breathing quickened. "What do you mean?" The male board member pulled out a folder, thin, neat, simple. He placed it on the bedside table like it belonged there. "We prepared a temporary arrangement," he said softly, "a compassionate solution. While you recover, we appoint an interim representative to handle public relations and urgent decisions." Mrs. Nghier's eyes darted to the folder. "Temporary?" "Yes," the board member promised too quickly. "Just until you're well." Tu Tieu's voice turned cold. "And who is the interim representative?" Lin answered before the board could. "I can do it," Lin said softly. "I know how to speak to the public. I can calm the crowd, and I can protect Yuri's future while he's away." Mrs. Nghia stared at her, breath caught. Tu Tieu's fists clenched. "This is your plan. You smear her name, collapse her health, then walk in here pretending you're the cure." Lin's expression stayed gentle, but her eyes flashed warning. "Don't be dramatic, Tu Tieu. People are suffering outside. The company is bleeding." Mrs. Nghia whispered, voice shaking. "I don't trust you." Lin's smile softened, almost sad. "Nghia, trust doesn't matter right now. Stability matters." The male board member slid a pen onto the table. "Mrs. Nghia, this is simply an authorization for interim representation. Nothing permanent." Tu Tieu grabbed the folder and yanked it away. "No." The board member's face tightened. "Miss, you can't." Tu Tieu snapped. "She's a patient under medical care. You have no right to pressure her." The female board member's voice remained sweet. "We're not pressuring. We're offering peace." Then Lin leaned closer to Mrs. Nghia, voice low, intimate, cruel in its softness. "Ko," Lin murmured. "If you refuse, the crowd grows. The board panics. Banks watch. And when Yuri returns, he returns to ruin. Do you want that on your conscience?" Mrs. Nghier's eyes filled with tears. She was cornered, not by force, but by guilt. Tu Tieu felt rage rise like heat in her throat, and then she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The paper in the folder wasn't just 1 page. There was a 2nd page clipped behind it, a page that looked like a resignation letter. Tu Tieu's breath hitched. She snapped the folder open fully. The board member lunged, trying to close it. Too late. Tu Tieu saw it clearly, prepared, formatted, ready, not temporary, a trap. Mrs. Nghie's lips trembled. What? What is that? Tu Tieu turned the page toward her slowly. Cool. They didn't come for an interim role. She swallowed hard. They came for your resignation. Lin's soft smile didn't move, but her eyes said the quiet part out loud. Sign it, or watch everything burn. For a moment, the hospital room didn't feel real. The thin curtain, the quiet hum of machines, the sterile smell, the pale light, and then, right there on the bedside table, papers that could erase a lifetime. Mrs. Nghia stared at the resignation page like it was written in another language. Her lips trembled. They prepared this? Tu Tieu's hands were tight around the folder. Yes, she said, voice shaking with controlled fury. This was never about helping you recover. This was about removing you while you're vulnerable. The male board member reached for the folder, forcing a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. Miss Tu Tieu, please, you're misunderstanding. You brought a resignation letter to a hospital bed, Tu Tieu cut in. There is nothing to misunderstand. The female board member's face hardened, but she kept her voice soft. Mrs. Nghia, the public is unstable right now. Your health incident is being discussed. Mrs. Nghie's eyes widened. Discussed? By who? Lin stepped closer, hands folded like a saint, expression full of concern. People are worried, she said gently. They're saying the company is in chaos because leadership is not well. Tu Tieu turned sharply to Lin. So you're using her illness as your final weapon. Lin's eyes cooled. I'm using reality. The public sees what it sees. Mrs. Nghie's breathing quickened. I didn't ask for this. I didn't choose to faint. And that's exactly why, Lin replied softly, leaning in. You should rest and let someone else carry the burden. Tu Tieu's voice dropped. You mean let you carry the keys? Lin's smile didn't move, but her eyes flashed, annoyed that Tu Tieu was still standing. The male board member slid the pen forward again. Mrs. Nghia, no one is forcing you, but we need a signature to stabilize the company, a temporary authorization. Tu Tieu slammed the folder shut. Stop saying temporary. You came with a resignation page prepared. The board member's jaw clenched. That page is only a precaution. A precaution for who? Tu Tieu snapped. For her safety, or for your control? Mrs. Nghia looked between them, tears in her eyes. She was exhausted, in pain, and now being asked to fight politics while her heart was still trembling from the fainting episode. She whispered, broken, please, not here. And that was when Tu Tieu made her move. She turned toward the door and raised her voice, loud enough for the hallway to hear. Nurse, doctor, security, please. The board members stiffened. Lin's calm expression finally cracked into irritation. Tu Tieu, don't make a scene. You walked into a hospital room with resignation papers, Tu Tieu replied coldly. You already made it a scene. A nurse rushed in first, startled. What's wrong? Tu Tieu pointed at the folder. They're pressuring a patient to sign company documents. This is harmful. The doctor said no stress, no visitors. The nurse's eyes widened. Mrs. Nghia, are you feeling okay? Mrs. Nghie's voice trembled. I feel worse. That was enough. The nurse immediately turned to the board members. You can't do this here. Please step outside. The male board member tried to keep his tone smooth. We're family friends. We're only... Outside, the nurse repeated, firmer. Lin's eyes narrowed. This is unnecessary. Tu Tieu stepped closer to Lin, lowering her voice. No, this is the boundary you don't get to cross. The nurse opened the door wider. A security guard appeared behind her. Hospital security, not company security. His presence shifted the entire room's power. Ma'am, he said to the visitors, you need to leave. The board members hesitated, embarrassment creeping into their faces. They didn't want a hospital incident to be added to their mess. Lin, however, didn't look embarrassed. She looked angry, but she still smiled, because Lin never lost control in public. She just changed tactics again. As the board members turned to leave, Lin stayed for half a second longer. She leaned closer to Mrs. Nghia and spoke softly, the words almost tender. "Ko," Lin murmured, "you can remove us from the room, but you can't remove the story. Outside they're still chanting. Tonight they'll chant louder." Mrs. Nghia's eyes filled. "Why are you doing this?" Lin's smile thinned. "Because you held what wasn't yours for too long." Then she looked at Tu Tieu, directly, like a challenge. "And because you think you can protect her with rules," Lin whispered. "But I don't play by rules." Then she stepped out. The security guard shut the door. The room finally exhaled. Mrs. Nghia sagged back into her pillow, shaking. Tu Tieu rushed to the bedside, gripping her hand. "Ko, you did great," Tu Tieu whispered. "You didn't sign anything." Mrs. Nghia's voice was weak. "But now? What will they do?" Tu Tieu's face tightened. "They'll escalate. Lin will make this look like Mrs. Nghia refuses accountability." Mrs. Nghia squeezed her eyes shut. "I'm so tired." Tu Tieu swallowed hard. "Then we'll fight so you can rest." Outside the hospital room, the nurse returned with the doctor. He checked Mrs. Nghia's vitals, frowned at the stress spike, and looked directly at Tu Tieu. "No more visitors," he said firmly. "Not today." Tu Tieu nodded. "I'll make sure." The doctor's tone softened slightly. "And keep her away from phones, news, anything that shocks her." Tu Tieu swallowed. "I'll handle it." When the doctor left, Tu Tieu sat alone for a moment, staring at her own phone like it was a ticking bomb. Because she knew Lin's next move was coming, and then it did. A notification appeared, one after another, messages from the company group chats, from staff, from neighbours. They're posting about her hospital. They're saying she collapsed because she's guilty. They're saying she's unfit to lead. There's a new statement going around. Tu Tieu's eyes narrowed. "She's fast," Mrs. Nghia whispered. "What are they saying now?" Tu Tieu forced a gentle smile. "Nothing you need to hear." But Mrs. Nghia's eyes pleaded. "Don't hide it from me." Tu Tieu hesitated, then chose honesty, carefully. "They're twisting your illness into a reason to remove you," Tu Tieu said quietly. "They're pushing the board to appoint someone else." Mrs. Nghia's lips trembled. "Lin," Tu Tieu nodded. "Yes." Mrs. Nghia stared at the ceiling, voice thin. "If I lose the company, Yuri loses everything." Tu Tieu's jaw tightened. "We won't let that happen." Mrs. Nghia turned her head toward Tu Tieu. "How?" Tu Tieu's expression hardened into decision. "We go public first, our way. Not in the lobby, not in a crowd. A controlled statement." Mrs. Nghia blinked. "I'm in a hospital bed." "Exactly," Tu Tieu said. "It shows the cost of this smear campaign, but we do it calmly." Mrs. Nghia's eyes widened with fear. "If I appear weak, it helps them." Tu Tieu shook her head. "Weak is not the same as guilty. If you speak with dignity, if you name this as harassment, people will feel it." Mrs. Nghia hesitated. "The board won't allow it." Tu Tieu's voice turned sharp. "Then the board is choosing Lin." She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, opened the audio file list, thumb hovering. Mrs. Nghia's eyes widened. "The recording?" Tu Tieu nodded. "The confession?" Mrs. Nghia swallowed. "But if we release it, will it backfire?" "It might," Tu Tieu admitted, "but right now Lin is controlling the narrative. The only way to break a story is with a louder truth." Mrs. Nghia closed her eyes, fighting tears. Yuri still can't be reached. Tu Tieu looked down at her own phone and tried again. Call failed. Message unsent. The silence from Yuri felt like an extra wound. And then, suddenly, her phone rang, a number she recognized. Yuri. Tu Tieu's breath caught. She answered instantly. "Yuri." The line was crackly, unstable, like the call itself was fighting to exist. "Tu Tieu?" Yuri's voice came through, rushed and strained. "What's happening? I saw breaking news. My mum." "Yuri, listen," Tu Tieu said quickly. Your mother is in the hospital, stress. Lin started a smear campaign. The board is trying to push an interim representative, and Lin brought resignation papers to her bed. Yuri's breathing turned sharp. What? Lin is there. She was, Tu Tieu said. We forced her out. Yuri's voice broke with anger. Put my mum on. She can't handle stress, Tu Tieu said urgently. Doctor's orders, but she's awake. She's safe right now. Yuri, do you trust me? A pause, the crackle louder. Yes, Yuri said. I trust you. Then I need you to do one thing, Tu Tieu said, voice steady. Send an official message from your company email to the board. You do not authorize any interim transfer, any resignation, any spokesperson appointment without your direct approval. Put it in writing. Yuri swallowed. I'll do it. I'll do it right now. And Yuri, Tu Tieu added, lowering her voice, we have a secret recording. Lin confessed. She planned it. She doesn't care about truth. She has an insider. Yuri's voice went cold. Save it. Protect it. Tu Tieu nodded even though he couldn't see. We will. The line crackled again. Tu Tieu, tell my mum, Yuri started. I will, she said quickly. But you need to stay connected. Don't disappear again. I'm trying, Yuri said, voice strained. Signal. The call cut. The screen went dark. Tu Tieu stared at the phone, breath stuck in her throat. But she had what she needed. Proof that Yuri had heard it. Proof that he would act. Mrs. Nghia's eyes searched her face. Was that Yuri? Tu Tieu nodded. Yes, he's sending a written order to the board. Mrs. Nghia exhaled shakily, tears spilling quietly. Thank God. Tu Tieu squeezed her hand. Ko, rest now. I'm going to the company. Mrs. Nghia's eyes widened. Alone? I won't be alone, Tu Tieu said softly. I'll bring the truth. As Tu Tieu stepped into the hallway, her phone buzzed again. Unknown number, a photo this time. It was a screenshot of a post circulating online. No words readable from this distance, but the image was clear. A blurred hospital bed. A silhouette that looked like Mrs. Nghia. Someone had leaked that she was hospitalized. Tu Tieu's blood went cold, and under the image, a second message arrived. Sign the resignation today, or tomorrow, the crowd comes to the hospital. Tu Tieu's hand shook, just once, then steadied. She stared at the screen, jaw clenched, eyes burning, because now Lin wasn't just attacking the company. She was threatening to turn a hospital into a battlefield. Tu Tieu lifted her chin, slipped her phone into her pocket, and walked toward the elevator like someone heading into war. Not with fists, with evidence, with strategy, with the promise she made to an old woman whose heart couldn't take another shock. No one signs anything. And behind her, in the hospital room, Mrs. Nghia stared at the ceiling, trying to breathe, while the shadow of Lin's words hovered over the bed like a storm waiting to break.